Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Rapici, how are you this evening?
Dr. Falk, I am unfortunately battling a case of the hiccups, but I'm doing well. I'm just going to sound like I'm interrupting myself dramatically from time to time.
Gilles Deleuze. Hiccups. Gilles Deleuze. Natural partners. Natural.
Sure.
Natural companions. The natural soundtrack, perhaps.
I'm willing to go with that. Yeah, I'm well, and I hope you are.
I am as well. And I am in mirthful laughter, engaged in mirthful laughter with you, not at you, but
I
with
appreciate
you
that.
over the situation. Dear listeners, here we are at the end of the world. What are we going to talk about in this particular podcast? We're going to talk about Gilles Deleuze. And in fact, we're going to revisit and we'll explain why we did this in a moment, in a nonce. But our purpose today in this compact episode, we are going to revisit and sort of produce a new look, we hope, at Gilles Deleuze's 1992, 1990, but who's counting? 1990, written in French, translated and published in October, the journal October 1992. The essay is called Postscript on the Societies of Control. And the first thing to mention is that it has been the subject of a podcast on this very episode of this very podcast, where we talked about well, two things. I think we talked about Deleuze in relation to William Burroughs, because the genesis, as Deleuze mentions, the genesis of Deleuze's essay is, I think, an event in 1975 when he participated in a conference with Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, and William Burroughs, who presented a lecture on basically kind of a nascent, certainly pre-digital, but um, a kind of whack McLuhan-esque take on television culture, media culture, basically on media that Burroughs talks about in terms of the limits of control. And in that essay on control and media, he is mostly, as the title suggests, interested in power dynamics. And in this particular essay, Deleuze returns, basically updates, this is why it's a postscript to the societies of control. Deleuze very consciously, tips his hat to Burroughs' notions of societies that define their social arrangement, power relations, according to this notion of control. So his starting point, Deleuze's starting point, is William Burroughs, is his essay, his meditation on the relation between media and power. But it's a postscript in the sense that he is very consciously going to update Burroughs' meditation on the society of control in relation to what he is noticing and is recognizing is the emergence of digital networks of control that seem to be rewiring, pardon the pun, everything. One last thing, and then I'll stop, and then you can tell me what I left out. This just very briefly, because we're going to talk about it with give it some more substance in a moment. I mentioned the tip of the hat to Burroughs, but the more important intertext, and basically it was the subject, I think, of our episode, our previous meditation on postscript in the society's control. There's a strong Foucauldian, Michel Foucault's, there's a strong dialogue, as so often in Deleuze's work, with the work of Michel Foucault. In particular, Michel Foucault's ideas of the disciplinary society from Foucault's 1975, 76, 77, something like that, mid-70s study called Discipline and Punish. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Foucault and his notion of the disciplinary society. But I want to stop here and allow my distinguished colleague an opportunity to fill in
I would.
anything I may have left out or anything or clarify what I obscured.
No, I think that's actually a really good job of setting the table. I think that the thing, our goal, Barry, as I understand the discussion, um, the goal is to talk about Foucault for a little bit, but not get bogged down. And I think that it's easy to do that. But we're trying to take a 2025 look at the essay as opposed to a 1992 look at the essay. But I think Foucault is really an important and the correct starting point, because
Yeah,
one of the
right,
things that
right.
Deleuze makes note of that I think is probably one of the more interesting reasons for doing an updated look at this essay
Mhm.
is that we are, as of 1990 or 1992, depending on which language you speak, um,
Elegantly done. Very
we
good.
thank you. You like that?
Very Gallic.
um,
Very Gallic. I appreciate that, Michael. Mhm.
we are, as he says, in a transition from disciplinary societies to societies of control. So it's interesting, I think, to jump 30 years forward from this and maybe take a look at what that transition looks like, whether we're still in transition. And it's interesting because one of the things that I think we're going to touch on here is that this notion of societies of control is sort of it's almost, I'm trying to think of a useful analogy here, but it's sort of like this Venn diagram of false freedoms. Where does that work for you? Like,
What? Um, in case you're not able to see it, and I'm assuming that our listeners can't see us, what Michael's responded to is I was startled by his statement. I think, but startled in the positive way because it's so. I think that's a wonderfully compressed way, an elegant way of saying that's a great takeaway from
so
what.
to
Yeah,
translate that in the event that your head isn't as in the essay as
yeah,
yours
yeah,
and
yeah,
mine is,
yeah.
right? The idea around the societies of control is that we're free to wander in ways that the
Mhm,
disciplinary societies did not allow,
mhm,
but that in gaining that alleged freedom or that apparent freedom, we're really allowing ourselves to be surveilled and tracked the entire time. So what's interesting though, and I think what makes this such a fun discussion to have, is that the means by which these various apparatuses and institutions function are, and I think this is according to Foucault. This I can't, you have to correct me whether this is Foucault or Deleuze here,
mhm,
but they function consistently. Maybe that isn't the right word, but they function consistently with their tools and their methods.
mhm,
And so as we've updated, obviously, the notion of what it means to be networked and what it means to be
mhm.
watched and how that functions is um, has evolved and has changed. So one of the big questions that I have as we make our way through this is, where in that process are we, and how have the tools of surveillance and the methods of
Mhm.
being surveilled and
Mhm.
surveilling, how have those evolved, and where does that, what have those done to the very institutions that's previously issued, or excuse me, that previously existed as um, very clearly
Linked to the disciplinary
as spaces
society?
of discipline. Yes,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
spaces of discipline.
places of discipline.
So we think, and I'll cede to you here in a second, but it's like we think of the workplace and the school and the hospital and the prisons, most notably, right,
Mhm.
as
Mhm.
these uh, sort of spaces of discipline, where now you even have in all of those. I mean, certainly in the schools and the workplaces, but also to, I think, an extended degree, the prisons. Um, this notion of kind of you can roam free and we do things differently, and I think it's interesting to look at how those have updated. So I think it's important to start with Foucault. I think we kind of want to make a quick jump into Deleuze, and then we can play as we will.
Well, I think we can indeed make that quick jump into Deleuze because I think our your very helpful discussion just now allows us to make quick work of the introduction. So I'm just going to sort of build on what you've already built and just move very, very quickly, determinedly through the text and signal what you're already talking about. You're saying that there is this kind of um, tension in Deleuze's text that, on the one hand, Deleuze is, he says this at several points. Uh, we're not quite in the new societies of control that I am trying to describe here. So that it's important for him because he sees a new form of power, of disciplinary power emerging that is not like the disciplinary forms of the 19th century. But, he can't, and he's very at great pains to this. He, you know, it would be easy if he would have an easy job if it was easy to say, clean break time here, we got a rupture here. That used to be what Foucault used to be able to describe how things were
Right.
going. Now we got something completely different, and it's kind of and William Burroughs anticipated. That's not quite the picture he wants to give. That's not what he believes. And so he has to move very carefully um, from within the Foucauldian framework in order to get outside of it.
I was going to say it's sort of, tell me if you think this is fair, but that transition is kind of a shift from form to effect.
Yes, that's a great
Right.
way of thinking of it,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, and he introduces very helpfully, as you were talking about um, the ways in which Deleuze is gesturing outside of Foucault, but using Foucault, I was thinking that, he does a really masterful thing, and I'm going to turn to it now. In the first section, the historical section, which is all Foucault, he does a I think we should mention this for those of our listeners who haven't read it, and we encourage, hey, we're talking about it for twice. I mean, shouldn't you, if you're listening to this episode, shouldn't you read it? We did it once, we did it twice. Do you really want to make us do it a third time? No, you don't. Come on, start reading it. But to
It's quick.
encourage you
It's
to read
quick.
it,
It's
it's
quick.
quick read. It's a short read, and so that is the short form of this, the compact form of this, is kind of, this is a McLuhan-esque moment, form and content, that he is trying to be pithy. And I think one of the reasons why he's pithy and condensed, now that means that we have to work as interpreters to tease things out. But I think there's another reason. I think we've already mentioned one of the reasons why this is a short essay, because the new societies of control aren't there yet. So he can't do a full analysis, right? I mean, I think this is a McLuhan-esque case of form and content kind of mirroring each other. This is a short meditation because what he is seeing and trying to describe and delineate, it's not quite there, Okay, so but anyway, back to what you were saying about, what we were talking about, like the ways in which Deleuze is sort of building on Foucault and also trying to peer around him and have us peer around the Foucauldian structure. He uses a very helpful word that I think does a lot of work in this short essay. And the word he uses that touches on what you just said a moment ago, Michael, is enclosures. By using the term enclosures, that is a masterful pedagogic way of indicating the shift from disciplinary societies, I think, to, it's a great pedagogy moment. That one word does a lot of work, especially in that first section. And the work it is mainly tasked to doing is allowing Deleuze to sort of clarify the distinction that he's trying to maintain between disciplinary societies and the new Burroughs predicted societies of control. Okay, with that, I'm going to go directly into the essay and see if we can move past the historical section into the meat of the essay. All right. Foucault located, this is the opening sentence, Foucault located the disciplinary societies in the 18th and 19th centuries. They reached their height at the outset of the 20th. They initiate the organization. Now he goes on, well, I can actually read the first three sentences and they fit in together. And then I'm going to skip to the end of the section, but let's go back for a moment. They imitate the organization of the disciplinary society. They're built around the organization of vast spaces of enclosure. The individual never ceases passing from one closed environment, each one having its own laws. So his examples of, and it's really interesting, it's institutions, rule-bound behavior. And he also gives this other descriptor for institutionally mandated rule-bound behavior, and that's the term enclosure. Um, all these spaces, all these enclosures have their own laws. First, the family, then the school, then the barracks, then the factory, from time to time, the hospital, possibly the prison, the preeminent instance of the enclosed environment. It's the prison that serves, in fact, as the analogical model. Okay, and let me
Can I make one note that I think is kind of
yes, and
important
I
here?
want to make one note, and then I'm going to go very quickly to the end of the section, and we'll dispense with Mr. Foucault and get right into
Yeah,
root of
I
this.
don't want to dwell on this because I don't want to get bogged down in Foucault, but I think this is important.
Yeah,
And it's going to come up. We're going to end up talking about this in a little bit.
sure.
He says that each space, each environment has its own laws. But I think it's important to note that, and I forget exactly how Foucault puts it, but the law, each these institutions occur in a succession,
Thank you.
right? So you go from the family to the school, from the school to the workplace. Perhaps at some point you deviate and end up in the prison system, or you end up in the, but there is a there's a process by which you move from one to the next to the next. And while the rules aren't the same, we learn by virtue of being a good citizen what the general idea of the rules are. So they're different rules. They're sort of idiosyncratic rules, but we are prepared for them. So it's not as if there's a drastically random set of expectations
Absolutely.
placed upon you. And I think that's
Absolutely.
going to be important when we start talking about what this looks like now with sort of
Right.
the idea of being
Right.
free to roam.
Guess what? Remember, I said that I had something to add? You
Yes.
just said what I wanted to add, except I will just very, very briefly add one PS to what you said. But I did want to make that point. Here's another point, though, that I think clarifies the difference in the societies of control. Another thing to add to what you said is that there is a space in the disciplinary society that's going to get lost in the new society control. And what's the space? What you were talking about, right? There is a moment of freedom within the disciplinary society, not within the spaces of enclosure, not within the precincts of these institutional matrices or matrices or whatever, not within these particular networks, but as you know, this I feel I'm just sort of elaborating
Hmm.
the last step of what you said. As a consequence, when you move from one institution, from one enclosure to another, there is a moment of relative freedom
In a disciplinary society.
in a disciplinary society
Right.
that's going to get kind
That
of
obliterated.
okay, no, or maybe not. I don't know.
No, I
I'm
think
okay.
so. But I think the so just to make sure that we're having the same
Yeah,
conversation here,
yeah.
the reason that those laws and those rules, that socially sanctioned sense of appropriate behavior,
Hmm.
can be suspended is
Hmm.
because the locus of control in the disciplinary society is located in particular spaces and
Indeed.
institutions. And so you are actually able to physically step outside,
Sure.
and on your walk from the home to work, Well, I guess that's a terrible example because you're still socially bound to behave in a certain way, and we understand how society works. But you are still removed from the rules of the home because you're not
Yeah,
in the
well, and
home.
I was calling that I don't know if we were saying something different because I was just saying that's a space of relative quote unquote freedom, that path, that journey from one institution. But you're saying it's not,
Well,
or
I'm saying
I don't
it's
know if we're disagreeing, or
no,
maybe
I
we
don't.
were.
I think that I'm digging myself into weeds that I don't want to be into here. My point is that Foucault argues that there is a socially sanctioned appropriate sense of appropriate behavior
Mhm.
and inappropriate behavior. So even though you are physically between spaces, it would still be bad to push a person down or kick.
Yeah.
Like you are still required socially to, and that's because of what? Well, that's to his point. That's the reach of the prison system, or that's the reach of the other institutions. But there are spaces where you are for a period outside, which I think
Well, I think we go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, I think as we make the shift into what Deleuze and Burroughs are talking about, we see those spaces shrink.
Mhm. Control is not necessarily going to be tagged according or limbed or just energized by the space, activated by the space of enclosure. Absolutely. So let me move quickly the to the opening gesture beyond Foucault or outside of Foucault. These are okay, let me pick it up here. But everyone knows that I love this this sentence. I recently taught this essay, Michael, and I read this passage out loud, and it's like the first time I read it, it's like when the first time I read this passage out loud, I realized how kind of Gallic or French or powerfully rhetorical it is. I don't know what to say. But the administrators in charge never cease announcing supposedly necessary reforms to the spaces of enclosure. But everyone knows that these institutions are finished, whatever the length of their expiration periods. Cut low, institutions, cut low enclosures, except that doesn't mean that's not the end of the story. It's only a matter of administering their last rites and of keeping people employed until the installation of the new forces knocking at the door. But unfortunately for us all, there are new forces knocking at the door. Back to Deleuze. The new forces at the door are the societies of control, which are in the process of replacing the disciplinary society. As we alluded to, let me just sort of underscore that. Um, in the process of replacing, in the process of replacing the disciplinary societies. Control is the name Burroughs proposes as a term for the new monster, one that Foucault recognizes, though I don't know where, as our immediate future. That I think to answer that question, we'll have to do another episode in Foucault, but we're not going to do that anytime soon. Well, I'll stop right there. That's, I think, he's what he's doing in that first section, just to summarize. Deleuze is open, gesturing and inhabiting to a certain bit the Foucauldian framework, and then he's saying, well, there are new forces, quote unquote. There are new forces knocking at the door, and it's societies of control. And now, the rest of his brief essay, he's going to try to uh, work through what seems to be the emerging rules or the emerging practices of these societies of control. So the question arises, if that's what the disciplinary look like, society look like, if it was organized around rule-bound spaces or what Deleuze designates as spaces of enclosure that encouraged, facilitated, generated certain behavior on the part of individual subjects. There are these new forces at the door. What do they look like? Are they enabled
Well,
by specific practices?
I have a question because I think
Yes,
that
yeah.
we got to be kind of careful here.
Mhm.
It's remember this is and maybe I'm just being a little pedantic here, and I apologize if that's the case. But remember, we're not necessarily moving out of or from the society of or the disciplinary society directly into something new. There's an overlap among these.
Yes. But
So
I don't know how else to designate the new forces at the door. That seems to designate it different. I mean, you're right. It's tangled. And if my narrative suggested like there's a new boss in town, I guess
yeah,
that's
I just
right.
want to I
But
want to
he
avoid.
does use the language new forces at the door. I guess that metaphor suggests that we haven't let them in yet.
Well, I don't know, and that's maybe the question. I think I would say that we have sort of the advent of the societies of control that begin to mesh with the disciplinary societies. So not that I don't take any issue with what you're saying, and I'm certainly not going to take issues with what Deleuze is saying because we're analyzing what he's talking about. Um, but maybe the question is, how does a society of control function in the latter stages of the disciplinary
Well,
society?
I like how you phrase that because I think I have a direct answer from the text. I love those moments.
We got to
So
run with
let me go
that.
there
Okay.
because lo and behold, in section two, I think Deleuze gives you a very specific answer to that question. In the societies of control, he had just been talking about the disciplinary society and the ways in which the signature designates the individual in the disciplinary society. He pivots to describe the limits or something, the techniques, I guess. Let's use that Foucauldian word for that. The techniques of the new society of control. Quote, in the societies of control, on the other hand, what is important is no longer either a signature or a number, but a code. The code is a password. And with that sense, and with that word, by the way, I'm going to interrupt the sentence, I'll pick it up. But the code is a password. This is one of the prescient moments in here, right? Because what Deleuze, one thing that I think was clear to me in sort of rereading this text for pedagogic purposes is the ways in which our internet, now we're going to talk about this directly in a couple minutes, so I don't want to get too far into it, but that uh, Deleuze isn't even talking about, not only is he not talking about, or is he foreseeing Internet 3.0 ruled by the algorithm, he isn't really even talking about Internet 2.0. He is just talking about this liminal moment that is, as much defined by the credit card and by bank codes as much as it is by the algorithm, right?
Well,
Because,
to
or
it,
no, you
no, no, I
disagree?
agree. I was going to say, to me, this feels like he's acknowledging the shift from a physicality, right? An economy based on physical goods,
Absolutely.
say,
Yes, he is. Right.
to an information-based economy where
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely.
that seems to be the and and I think that makes sense when you think about you now in 20 30 years out on, we still certainly there is still a physicality, right? We still have plants, we still have
Devices and right.
workers, we still have
Yeah.
tools. I mean,
Mhm.
but it's not about having them. It's about knowing how to effectively work amongst them, which gets us, I think, shortly and back into that Venn diagram metaphor.
I
So,
just wanted, yeah, and I
yeah,
just was trying to say that this is an even earlier. Well, I think you just well described. I just wanted to make the general point that we're not even talking about Internet 2.0. We're talking about Internet 1.5, really. But you just described the crucial conditions of Internet 1.5, I think. So, yeah, yeah, it's about access, being allowed to move within the network. That becomes the new
right.
sort of space of it. Uh, of what's the word, exclusion and inclusion, right? And maybe that's another way of thinking about the difference in the society's control. The new axis is, are you included or are you excluded from exercising or moving within the network?
But there's
That's what the
also,
password is limiting, right?
pardon me?
That's what the password is there to limit.
Well, but isn't there also sort of a weird thing going on here where the signature, for example,
Mhm.
requires an authentic physical presence, right? Like you have to provide.
Password. And if I have your
But if you
password,
have my password, you can
I don't
become
need
me.
your,
No,
yes, exactly.
so
Right, right,
it again, it's
right.
the shift away from which is kind of astounding because again, this is 1990 or 92, where the idea of a networked society in the terms that we use now
Right,
was
exactly.
absolutely beyond comprehension.
No, Michael, I think we have to linger at this moment because and this was one of the reasons I wanted to make that tedious marker, the payoff for mentioning like this is really early, is to sort of highlight really a stunning moment of prescience in this essay. And you just described it. This is stunningly prescient. We don't really have the network, but he has understood that dynamic. He's seeing, I'll read this, finish reading the
Yeah, yeah,
sentence,
yeah.
but he is foreseeing, I think, how this grid of power, how the new society of control is going to exert itself. Okay.
Go a little further
Go back.
because it gets even more insane
Yeah.
about 6 lines down.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick up and read with deliberate speed. I'm gonna go back and then go forward with deliberate speed. In the society's control, on the other hand, what is important is no longer either a signature or a number, but a code. The code is a password in italics, while on the other hand, the disciplinary societies are regulated by watchwords. The numerical language of control is made of codes that mark, as you were using the word, that we're entering into the new information society. So the numerical language control is made of codes that mark access to information or reject it. We no longer find ourselves dealing with a mass individual pairing. Individuals have become individuals in his new coinage. And Matt, I bet that took I wonder if that took the translator, like 90 years, 90 days to figure out, well, how am I going to translate that? And masses, samples, data, markets, or banks. Perhaps it is money that expresses the distinction between the two societies best, since discipline always referred back to minted, like you were saying, minted money, right?
Right.
Material. Material money that locks gold in enclosure again, in as numerical standard, while control relates, oh boy, howdy does it. Control relates to floating rates of exchange. Last comment on this, and I'm anxious to hear what you say. Um, this is the other place where he's so crazy prescient. Um, uh, in that last part of the sentence, but also throughout for the remainder of the essay, what he also foresees is that the transformation in capital that will come along, move lock and step with the advance of this new information society.
So, talk to me for a second about this wonderful term, individuals. Individuals have become individuals. How do you understand that?
Yeah, I wish you didn't ask me that. No, no, no. I'm ready for it. Although I have an answer, but I'm very tentative about it, so I'm curious. I'm eager
So
for
my
your
my my
correction.
question, my
Oh,
question. I'll go ahead and
okay.
stick my neck out first.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
I'm,
go.
I'm
Okay.
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 Uh, because I'm good at being wrong. I don't have a problem with this.
All right.
So as we move towards this away from watchword to password, right? It's this is an individual marker, but it's a knowledge-based marker. I understand individuals, right? The individual is sort of a person in a mass, and you're identifiable by your password, but it's less of a let me start this over. I feel like the individual exists as a part of a mass whereas the individual still exists as a part of a mass, but is more easily identifiable as an individual
Or how about this?
because,
Maybe the individual exists in a diminished relationship, maybe an even more diminished, weakened relationship to the mass.
well, I feel like what happens here is in the society, okay, in the disciplinary societies, we are disciplined as a whole, as a mass.
Well, he says there's a diet. Well, I don't know if I read it that way. Now,
Well,
he
let
says the
me,
disciplinary society. Well, let me just say this though,
yeah,
because this might clarify something. But as I understand it, that when he says that the disciplinary society assumed that it had an operative binary.
yes,
So there was the individual, and
yes,
then there was the mass. And these
yes.
are they exist in binary relations. I assume that the individual no longer exists as a clear and distinct other to the binary opposite of the mass. So that's kind of my take on this. But okay, now I'm sorry to have
That's no,
interrupted.
no, that's fine. It's a bit to juggle. What I so the thing that marks the real difference between the societies of control and the disciplinary society is mobility, right? The borders have been broken down. And as a result, we are able to move from checkpoint to checkpoint to checkpoint, right? From one various enclosure to another, seemingly freely, but limited by our information, right? Do you have the password for this?
Right,
Do you
right.
have the credentials to be
Because
here?
we could come to a space, and this will be the end of our journey. We come to a space where the password doesn't work. We don't have
Right.
security
We are,
clearance,
but
right?
our individuality
Uh-huh.
is is conversely defined in a society of control by our ability to produce these passwords, right? So it's like we become more anonymous because of our ability to float around,
Yeah.
but yet
Yeah.
we're more easily identifiable based on
Oh.
our ability to produce said password.
Oh, well, I
So
have that's a wonderful
in a
observation.
weird way, I feel like the individual is sort of the anonymous or less immediately identifiable. You look, if I'm floating around on the highway here, right, I might be a worker at company A or a worker at company B,
They're
but you
more
don't,
anonymous.
but
You
you-
don't know.
but I'm not defined by my space anymore. What I'm defined by now
In fact, you're
is
not defined at all, really, right?
no, but I'm identifiable based
There
on
you
my
go.
ability.
Maybe that's what we're talking about.
Yes, I think so. That's
You
what
are
that's how I'm
defined.
understanding
Okay, in the individual
is
can be defined, but is not identifiable.